to his family. You are his employer. The taxpayers pay for his health insurance to the tune of about $5,000 a year. I've asked you this before, Mike. If health insurance for working people is too expensive, why working people paying $5,000 for your family's health insurance is not too expensive?
Time's up, Mr. Hyatt. Mr. DeWine?
Well, there you go again, Joel, distorting the record, not talking the facts. Let's try to go back and look at the facts. The facts are that when President Clinton made his proposal to Congress, Mr. Hyatt was in favor of that proposal, came out in favor of it. Then he modified his position as the months went on, and then later on basically came out against Mr. Clinton's proposal. So, Joel, you've changed and flip-flopped again on that issue. I've been consistent. Let me tell you what I think. I think that Bill Clinton was right when he talked about the problem. He did a great job talking about the problem, and I applauded that the night he gave that speech. I didn't like his solution, nor did the American people, or at least the majority of American people, like his solution, because they were not willing to turn over 1/7 of the U.S. economy and the most precious thing they have in their life, which is the health and welfare of their family members, to the federal bureaucrats. But there are things we can do, and there are things that this Congress should have done and that I hope the next Congress will do. Portability. We should never have a problem when someone wants to change jobs and keeping insurance. We should be able to do away with the pre-existing health care exclusion, to take care of that young couple that comes up to me who has a little child who's sick and they're afraid to change jobs because they'll lose their insurance. We can have tort reform, medical malpractice reform, which Mr. Hyatt is against. I'm in favor of it. I think it's good. And we need to allow the states the flexibility to do what Ohio wants to do and Governor Voinovich and I want to do, which is to insure and deal with 400 to 500,000 Ohioans under a program we call Ohio Care.
Thank you, Mr. DeWine. Mr. Torrey has a follow-up.
Yeah, in 30 seconds, Joel. I'm not quite sure if you completely answered the question. Would you support
last night in a debate for the U.S. Senate. They're running for the seat now held by Democrat Howard Metzenbaum, who's Mr. Hyatt's father-in-law. We'll show you a Maryland Senate debate early Friday morning around 5:30 Eastern and the New York Governor's debate around 9:05 Eastern Time on C-SPAN 2.
Are you ready to fight this year? Are you ready to win this year? All right.
Throughout this election season, C-SPAN provides a state-by-state look at the nation's key races. Our cameras follow the major candidates as they meet with voters. We show you a sampling of the campaign commercials. You see debates between the candidates. You can voice your opinion and ask questions about the fall races during live viewer call-ins. And November 8th and 9th, C-SPAN brings you election results. Our coverage includes live simulcasts from local television stations across the country. From the campaign trail to the debates and election night coverage, C-SPAN is the network of record for Campaign 94. On November 1st, the Supreme Court hears oral arguments in the case American Airlines versus Wolins. And this Saturday on America and the Courts, we preview the case. The question is whether new restrictions in airline frequent flyer programs may be challenged by state law. Our program features representatives from both sides of the case. American Airlines Incorporated versus Wolins, a case involving frequent flyer rule changes. Saturday on America and the Courts, beginning at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 Pacific.
Next, remarks by Camille Paglia, humanities professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Ms. Paglia spoke Wednesday evening to students and faculty of Georgetown University. In addition to her work in academia, Ms. Paglia is the author of several books, including Sex, Art, and the American Culture. Her remarks run about an hour and 20 minutes.
Good evening. Good evening. I guess the mic is already turned on. On behalf of Chapters Literary Bookstore and Vintage Books, I'd like to welcome you to Gaston Hall at Georgetown University for an evening with Camille Paglia. You may have noticed when you came in, there were some index cards. We've decided that might be the easiest way to do questions and answers this evening. So, yes, it's time to pick them up off the floor. They were sort of scattered about the seats. As Professor Paglia is speaking, about halfway through her talk, we'll send some people down to collect cards. I think that would probably be the smoothest procedure, as we're being taped by C-SPAN tonight. So it should be a fun evening. So everyone can be thinking about a question you might like to pose. So I think we are ready to start. It is a great pleasure to welcome our reigning literary pugilist, Camille Paglia, Professor of Humanities at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. I think a lot of people have an opinion about her, especially those who haven't read her, perhaps like Susan Sontag. But as a bookseller, I want to say that I think Camille Paglia should be read and read widely, but not for the obvious reason, the commercial one, but because whether taking her heady, headlong view of Western culture in the not just groundbreaking, but positively seismic study, Sexual Persona, or whether penning her dazzlingly apt précis of pure pop and other eminently discussable phenomena in her essays, Sex, Art, and American Culture, or her newest collection, Vamps and Tramps. In short, whether her topic is John Keats or Jackie Kennedy, she is a much-needed antidote to the lofty, rote, solipsistic, or simply lazy habits of thinking. And again, speaking as a bookseller, I know the importance that Professor Paglia places on film, TV, and the whole mass media matrix. And I think that she, or rather her books, are a great demonstration of how the printed word can hold its own against them, and how the printed word has its own, if I dare say it, chthonic strength. Please welcome Camille Paglia.
Good evening. It's wonderful to be here for my first lecture in Washington. Very odd. I haven't been invited down here. We're approaching the 5th anniversary in February of the release of my first book, Sexual Personae. And my third book, Vamps and Tramps, has just been released. That's 3 books in 5 years. So those who think that I'm going to go away are sadly mistaken. And if I had come here 2 years ago, you would have gotten sort of a vintage Paglia, lectern-pounding Amazonian performance. But so successful has been the reform movement in feminism and in academia that I can come here and be gracious to tonight. So, because it's obvious my side is winning. My work comes out of my sense of the enormity and complexity of Western civilization. And those who have been reading my work, as opposed to those who are simply reading about me, are aware that my biggest overarching theory, and this is not a surprise to anyone who knows anything about the West, is that Western culture is a combination of 2 great traditions, the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman. They are parallel to each other, but they influence each other. A great deal of Neoplatonism went into the formation of Christian theology, and elements of the mystery religions of the ancient Mediterranean can still be detected in the Christian service, and so on. What I'm saying in my work is that I, as a radical 60s libertarian, analyze contemporary culture in terms of public sphere and private sphere. My argument is that government has no right to intrude into the private sphere. Therefore, I am for unrestricted abortion rights, abolition of all sodomy laws, legalization of drugs, even though I do not take drugs and I'm fully aware of the destruction of my generation through drugs. I am for the decriminalization of prostitution. I am radically pro-pornography. It seems to me that the public sphere, however, needs equal respect. The public sphere is shared by both traditions, the Judeo-Christian and the Greco-Roman. These ideas are behind all of my political thinking. And at this moment, as we are launching into the midterm congressional elections and we're moving toward the next presidential election and so on, I'm very concerned as a Clinton Democrat, and I look forward to voting for Clinton again, even though I'm in despair about the way his administration is run by underlings who should be booted out immediately. I am very apprehensive about the direction of our politics. I believe that a great moment was missed in the establishment of progressive values just after the inauguration of President Clinton by the kind of rabid partisanship of, again, the underlings of Clinton. I'm very concerned about a certain kind of discourse that is coming out of the Democratic Party and out of the major feminist organizations and the abortion rights organizations which I support. I despise the kinds of rhetoric that calls people of religious belief fanatics, radicals, the ignorant, the benighted. And I speak as an atheist. I don't believe in God. I left the Catholic Church 25 years ago because of its dogma. But I respect all religions of the world. Indeed, my prescription for an enlightened multiculturalism is that a core curriculum for the world would be the study of all the great world religions, that the sacred texts of every religion should be assigned, should be known, the Quran, the Bible, the Gita, that the sacred shrines, the sacred rituals of every religion be known, because no culture can be understood without knowing its religious background. I'm coming out of the 60s at a time when it seemed to me there was a wonderful fusion of progressive politics with respect for spiritual questing. Even though my generation turned against the organized religions, we were spiritual in other ways. We inherited the beatniks' interest in Zen Buddhism, and we ourselves made a passage to India. Hinduism was everywhere in my college years, from 1964 to 68. Indian music was everywhere in rock. We had a cosmic perspective. We had a respect for nature. All of that has disappeared. Progressive politics today are spiritually empty. There is a rabid social constructionism that has taken over the elite schools, which sees human beings as nothing but the sum of environmental pressures. There's no feeling for nature whatever any longer. The entire cosmic dimension to 60s thought is gone. We of the 60s saw social injustice and wanted to remedy it. I'm a 60s social activist. But we saw beyond society the great wheel of the cosmos, the movement of the stars and the sun and the moon, what Hinduism calls the cycle of birth and death. What has happened is, it seems to me, the most original and provocative minds of my generation did not go on into the professions, and their view has been lost to the general culture. And we must be honest about the role that drugs played, because LSD gave vision, but then deprived its users of the ability to put those visions into material form. Now, I never took LSD because my brain was already odd enough. John Lennon similarly said, although he took a lot of LSD, that he did not have to take it because his mind worked that way to begin with. I have called my style of writing psychedelic criticism, and I remain committed to that vision, which I think has still had no influence on the world at large, except through the return of tie-dye t-shirts at Grateful Dead concerts. Psychedelic rock, the Jefferson Airplane, the whole San Francisco sound is in my work. The great incisive, reverberating sound of the lead guitar of the acid bands is in my work. That's the sound of the voice in Sexual Personae. This is why people who know rock like my work. People who do not like rock find my work too overwhelming, too loud, too pushy, but that's rock. Keith Richards is my idol. My generation was extremely creative because it was a moment in history when West and Far East came together, and the two came together only for a moment, only for a few years. And what those ideas produced have never been registered in our higher culture. So my work seems very odd. By the time I was able to be published, I was in my 40s, and people said, "What is she? What is this? How bizarre." And that is the tragedy, that all the other books are missing. The books by all the other people. There should have been dozens of books by the thinkers of the 60s, and they're missing. I'm still hoping there are people out there, unpublished, who now will be published in New York, because I similarly could not get printed for 20 years. But we have to realize that the 60s went through and demolished all inherited values. And what we did was leave a very empty landscape for the generations that have come after us. I am a teacher of 23 years. I'm very, very concerned about what the young are getting in the classroom. I despise what is going on in the elite schools. I despise the professors of humanities in the elite schools, because what they have done is to destroy the values of their students without giving anything sustaining in its place. Certainly, education should be all about questioning cultural assumptions, questioning the way one was brought up. But then, teachers have an obligation to give spiritual food. In my work, that is art. Art, for me, is a religion, and it's coming out of Italian culture. There is no doubt that Italians have a reverence for art and a reverence for the artist that is no longer fashionable in the elite schools. There is no longer any sense of greatness in discussions of literature and art in the elite schools. It is utterly obscene what is being done in the name of progressive politics on the elite school campuses. As I go out and lecture to the Ivy League, invited by the students, of course, and boycotted by the faculty, I am appalled at what I'm finding. Standards have not been dropped in the sciences or in the social sciences, but in the humanities, there is chaos, utter chaos. I am 47 years old, and I have devoted my life to studying the arts, and I feel I still know nothing. I'm still at the beginning of knowing everything I want to know about literature and music and painting and so on a worldwide basis. What are we doing to our best students by forcing them to read the most mediocre, labyrinthine, post-structuralist influence garbage by 10th-rate academics? I see there are people here who know what I'm talking about. We have very little time in college, very little. That time should be spent exposing students to great works. It is not critics who make the canon. That is ridiculous. It is artists who make the canon. What is great is determined by how an artist has influenced artists who come after him or her. Thus we know Sappho is great because she influenced 1,000 years of Greek and Roman lyric poetry. Other poets attested to it. Similarly with Shakespeare. It is not just a bunch of white men sitting in a room and cooking up a plot to maintain their power. It's ridiculous. Think of Dante. Was Dante a patriarch? Dante was a weirdo who was driven out from his own city. He obsessively wrote a poem putting all of his enemies in hell. I understand that completely. In general, the great artists have always been eccentrics and dissenters. They've usually been people who were beaten up in the schoolyard. The idea that somehow these are series of powerful people who somehow had political aspirations, it is a form of mental illness, these ideas. Sometimes the works one assigns in class are not enjoyable. They aren't easy. I can recall being very bored with Dante when it was introduced to me at the freshman year. Similarly, Aeschylus. I was bored. But over time, those works are so complex and have such deep value that I couldn't get rid of them. They're in my mental life. And so as the decades go on, things from Aeschylus and from Dante come back to me and suddenly seem very applicable to human life. And this is what we need to do. We need to make such hard decisions and say, here are great works, great complex works we do not understand, and we are simply bequeathing them to our students. And the students come into the presence of those works. We cannot fully explain them. Right? So I despise the kinds of theory that has gotten people the highest positions, won people the highest positions in the elite schools. The kind of theory where you look down at the text and are very superior to it and think you know more than the artist and so on. These people are sophists. These people are careerists. We're dealing with a crisis of major proportions in education. Major proportions, because there's a lost generation of young people who have had this kind of education coming out of the Ivy League. And I want to save at least the generation after that, and bring our educational system back to a sense of value, beauty, art, intellect, quality. It is ridiculous that to invoke such terms in America makes you be called a neoconservative. How that is possible? Why have we ceded to the right issues of value and quality and distinction? It's a form of madness, again. So I am running on a platform that is radically pro-art, right? And that is 60s insofar as I uphold, above all, free thought and free speech. Therefore, I am, of course, opposed to speech codes of every kind. And as I said earlier, I am very concerned about the direction of American politics, the repolarization of right versus left, after what I thought was a new coming together, a new synthesis that seemed to be taking shape in the Clinton campaign and the months just before the inauguration. We cannot have a situation where religion is something that only the far right will talk about, that spiritual values are only something the far right will talk about. Right? It seems to me that, that the left has a great deal of atoning to do. I am on record as opposing the atrocious acts of ACT UP when it invaded St. Patrick's Cathedral and threw the host on the ground. I, again, do not believe in God, but I believe any profanation of sacred ground is an abomination that would not be tolerated, obviously, if we were dealing with a Native American ritual or an African tribal ritual. What privileges are pseudo-leftists, who are usually white, middle class, and coming out of a sense of entitlement that I think utterly unjustified. What privileges people to behave like that? Whenever we have that kind of excess, you get a counter-reaction. I feel that we must have respect for all spiritual traditions. When we look at Martin Luther King or Gandhi, we see those men were orienting themselves toward the spiritual history of their people. Gandhi was westernized, yet took on the robes of a Hindu monk. Martin Luther King was a minister, and so when he gave that incredible speech, the I Have a Dream speech, one of the great speeches of the 20th century, he was speaking from the soul to all the people of America. And it was an extraordinary moment, an extraordinary eloquence that streamed from him, an incredible spiritual epiphany in recent American history. What in the history of gay activism do we have anywhere comparable to that? There's not one single figure in gay activism or in feminism that has that kind of stature, because our progressive organizations have set themselves in a juvenile fashion against religion and against religious belief. Now, again, my theory about the public sphere. Every religion has the right to lobby for policy decisions, for things affecting the public sphere, but no religion may dominate the discourse. It is up to our elected officials in a democracy to decide among all the various options. Neither Judeo-Christian nor Greco-Roman should dominate the public sphere. But we cannot have a situation where, of total disrespect and the kind of wanton sacrilege that, again, I think is pushing the nation to the right. I define the Greco-Roman tradition as being the history of art. We see how often you have homoerotic elements in the Greco-Roman side, going back to Sappho and to the amazing homoerotic art of classical Athens. And again, one of the great high points of the history of the West, Renaissance Florence, where again you get many homoerotic themes, and in this case, open homosexual artists and so on. So I would like a kind of discourse that can say, yes, the Bible condemns homosexuality. Let's stop lying. It does. Right? The Bible does. I don't want any historical lies. I don't want propaganda. I don't want the explaining away stories in ways that just don't make any sense. Let us admit that. The Judeo-Christian tradition sets itself against homosexuality for complex reasons that cannot just be summarized as bigotry or homophobia. Complex moral reasons. Similarly, many religious people oppose abortion on profound ethical grounds. And I despise the tone with which the feminist establishment has treated the pro-life side. I speak from the position of abortion advocacy. I can clearly see that the ethical weight in this argument is probably on the other side. That is, we career women are arguing from expedience. We are declaring it is onerous for us to bear an unwanted child, and we are putting our professional success above that of the life of the child. Why is it that people who argue from this pro-life position are stereotyped as anti-woman? I have been deluged with literature from all of these organizations, feminist and abortion rights groups and so on, for 15 years, with the most hysterical language in it. Irrational, delusional language that sounds like the Salem witch trials, talking about people on the far right who are simply acting out of their ethical beliefs as if they are demons. Okay, this demonization of the opposite political side is one of the most unsavory features of current political life. I began to realize this as in the last 4 years I have had many long discussions with reporters from Europe or from South America. And I realized the greater political sophistication of people outside of America. We are simply suffering from this polarity. People here have to be either Democrat or Republican, on the left or on the right. That's all. In Europe and elsewhere in the world, there are an incredible number of individual parties, and there is a wide spectrum of political belief. So I would notice that I would be talking in America with one of our reporters, or trying to talk to a student who was under the feminist cloud, and I would discover, that it was almost impossible to have any kind of a systematic discussion on any issue with these people. They believe that they have the truth. The truth has come down to them on high. All right? They are most extraordinary. It's an amazing kind of a priori thinking that it is just as bad as the dogma of the Catholic Church that I fled 25 years ago. But when I would be talking with a foreign reporter, and those also from Britain, I would discover that no matter what their position was politically, they would be very interested, and they would understand the sum total of my argument, and they would ask very interesting questions about each point. I see, so on this issue, you are here. Well, may I ask, what do you think about this, and this, and this, and this? And we'd be moving along and making this conceptual structure. Right? It is absolute folly in this country. It's absolutely embarrassing to me, right, that the progressive side of the political spectrum has slid into this kind of mass hysteria that makes rational discussion of anything unpopular impossible. Now let us just take an example that's right in the news right now, this issue about IQ differences among races. People are lamenting and saying some people, it shouldn't even be discussed at all, et cetera, et cetera. Now here is a very good example of my principle that the more you suppress speech, the more you drive issues to the right, okay? Because over 20 years ago, there were men, sometimes of questionable credentials, out there who were trying to push the line that there are genetic differences in intelligence. But these people were hounded and harassed and abused, all right, and lynched and so on. What did that do? What that did was drive out for the last 20 years from this area of inquiry every reasonable person, every liberal person, every moderate person, because no one wants to be abused. What is the end result? By the time the issue resurfaces, okay, you get the scientific information attached now to a conservative agenda, all right? So again, I appeal to America. to realize that free speech, free inquiry is at the heart of any democracy. We must allow every unsavory notion to be fully aired, fully investigated. This has been true in many areas. For example, the issue of busing. Busing was devised 25 years ago as a tool of integration of schools. I mean, a laudable ideal, obviously, for our country. But once it was set into motion, it could never be discussed again. The cultural elite, all right, the Northeastern establishment, will not permit that issue to be discussed. It does not matter that there are people in the working class below the level of the literati and the wordsmiths who dominate the literary establishment. It does not matter that the effects of busing were being felt by people who did not put that policy into effect. People put it into effect often sent their children to private schools. All right. Now, what is the result? That issue is never ever discussed. The only people who will discuss it after 20 years will be figures on the far right. So when I noticed that Pat Buchanan began talking about busing during the last campaign and so on, I said to people, there is a very good example of this. All right? When you do that, when you suppress an issue in the general culture, you drive it underground, and all you do is add to the prestige and the power of people on the right who will voice it and who then become champions of the people. Do you understand, okay, how bad that is? We want people who are moderates, we want people who are liberals, who will speak for the people. What is leftism if it is not about the people? That's how it began, for heaven's sakes, in the last 200 years, all right? What we have now in America is most extraordinary elitist arrogance on the part of progressives who claim to speak for the people, but don't want to hear the people at all right? We don't want... So what I'm asking for is for even the terms left and right, liberal, conservative, to be totally rethought, and to realize how recent historically such terms are. They are not permanent. They were not created, in geological time. Darwin did not find any traces of them, all right, in mud flats and so on. It is possible for us to evolve beyond these sterile polarities. The 21st century will need something new. We're moving into a world culture. It seems to me that mass media are the language of this world culture, and everywhere the youth understand that language. The imagery of television is developing a part of the brain that is beyond testing. You see, this is why I'm skeptical about these recent reports about IQ differences, because I'm very aware that my own brain functions in a way that cannot be fully tested, that there is the Apollonian part of the brain, to use the terms of sexual personae, and there are these other areas that the drugs of the 60s were enlarging or were activating, right? And I'm aware that I'm thinking with different parts of my brain, and that never has a test yet been devised that has even gotten to the point from which my ideas come, my originality comes, and so on. And this is what I feel about African American culture. As someone who has I've taught now for 10 years in Philadelphia at the University of the Arts, and I'm privileged to have in my freshman classes the most brilliant young African American dancers and actors and so on who come directly into my classes from Philadelphia high schools and so on. And I'm aware that half the time in class, that when I'm talking, that there's a level of mental alertness in young African Americans that I'm speaking to. They are awake and alive and alert, and most of the white middle class kids in the classes are in a coma, all right? So, I mean, I don't accept that. I realize that white middle class people cannot always understand me. They just not understand what I mean, the terms I'm using, my body language, nothing. They're not getting it, all right? So I don't accept these recent findings, and I'm very irritated because the suppression of this entire area of research has kept us from really developing a new theory about the brain that will fit into the new dominance of popular culture in the world. Again, I feel that television stimulates a certain part of the brain. It is a kind of primitive thinking, there's no doubt for me. I understand that. It's primal. It's the area of sex and violence. It's sleazy. It's the tabloid style, you know, that goes right into that side of the brain, and so on. Right. But I think that, it fits beautifully into the high art tradition. For me, there is no cleavage between high art and popular culture. I do not accept it. No one, I think most of the people in my generation of the 60s also were very impatient with this idea that there is a high art and then a vulgar or popular art that is not of equal value. And here we are in the 90s, and we are still very far from finding a theory, a system that can explain or analyze the motifs of popular culture. Let's just take the example of rock and roll. I mean, I am 47 years old, and I have been listening to rock for 35 years. 35 years of rock and roll have gone through my brain and developed another part of the brain that has not been tested. Right? There are organs in there that are vibrating, that are humming. Right? I wake up in the morning and that track is playing. Many people from my generation have that experience. Today, the new Madonna album is playing in my head. Right? I won't give my critique of it. But we are very far from developing an aesthetics for rock. Here's one of the most revolutionary art forms in the history of culture that has utterly changed the world. And after 35 years, there are still many people in the literary establishment who reject rock, or who may listen to rock on the radio, in the car, or at home, but the experience of rock in no way has influenced the way they are working or writing or dealing with culture or politics or anything. There's something really wrong here. So the ambition of my life is to integrate the high art tradition with the great movement of popular culture of the 20th century. I have called the 20th century the age of Hollywood, rather than Sartre's idea, the age of anxiety. Hollywood, for me, is the entire entertainment industry. It is the return of Babylon. In my largest theory, what we have, this phenomenon of movies and television and sports and rock music and so on, advertisements, which I adore and consider an art form. What we have here is an eruption of the buried pagan element in Western culture. In my overarching theory, Judeo-Christianity never did defeat paganism. It went underground and has surfaced at three key moments. The first was the Renaissance. Most people would accept that. Greco-Roman humanism. We see that Botticelli's Venus is a version of the Gothic Madonnas, and so on. Then, more controversially, I see Romanticism as the second such eruption. That, for me, is the Dionysianism, the sort of the earth cult element in ancient paganism. And that's why you get the return of vampires and femme fatales and Gorgon figures and so on, which so many puny little theorists try to dismiss as misogyny, as a reaction somehow to feminism, these bizarre and pathetic theories that have circulation on campus. On the contrary, these femme fatales are the real thing. They're coming from the Chthonian realm, deep within the earth. It's a return of the repressed, of Dame Mother Nature, and of the power of the earth. And now, in the 20th century, the third great eruption of this buried pagan element, and that is popular culture. All of the things in popular culture which ministers and priests most detest, the sex, the violence, all those things they find most unpalatable, that's exactly the pagan element. Because ancient paganism was far more truthful about both sex and violence than Christianity ever has been. Now, from all my respect for Christianity, I am not a Christian. I have never been able to be a Christian because my particular kind of inflammatory Aries character, I'm a dominating woman, extremely aggressive and obnoxious. Nothing in Christianity allows for that except in the lives of the saints, who are my heroes and heroines. And of course, in my new book, in Vamps and Tramps, there is a meditation, in fact, on an image of a saint that my grandparents brought from Italy, a mysterious saint, very melancholy. We did not know his identity. He seemed just a frail young man. It turned out 5 years ago there was a spate of publicity in American papers. This saint, Gabriel Possenti, had a wild and reckless youth, was an expert marksman, and in his monk's robe had faced down an attack of bandits on town where his monastery was. And he pulled out a pistol, apparently, and shot a lizard through the head, okay? And I love this, and I offer this persona of the pistol-packing monk, you see, to the students of today. That seems to fuse for me the great traditions. But Christianity, again, has not been able to deal adequately for me with either sex or aggression, because both sex and aggression belong to nature, to what Christianity would define as the fallen realm. I think many members of my generation, many women, were restive under the influence of Mary as she was defined by the American Catholic Church of the Betty Crocker 50s. Mary as obedient, as the servant of God, as silent. Well, nothing could be less silent or docile than my generation of women, who, when they arrived in college in the mid-60s, changed everything, changed the whole cultural landscape, not only of America, but of the world. And it was not feminism that did this. Feminism burst forth again after being dormant for so many decades, since women won the right to vote in the early 1920s. It was not feminism that did this. Rather, the feminist movement sprang forth at the end of the 60s as an outgrowth of our rebellion. Most of the women that I knew in college from 1964 to 68, bawdy, feisty, aggressive, women who could deal with men, who loved pornography and so on, most of those women did not become feminists. Most of those women are out in the general culture. And I, however, have been committed to feminism for my entire life, before even feminism was reborn, before Betty Friedan wrote her book, before Gloria Steinem decided to join the movement, and so on. What I represent in the feminist tradition is symbolized by the cover of my new book, where I am posing with knife in scabbard. I am wearing I'm in my Diana Rigg Avengers mode. As a guerrilla fighter, I'm wearing a Marine Corps jacket I bought in the Army Navy store. As a symbol also, and this fits in with the red, white, and blue colors of the cover, as a symbol of, it seems to me, the need to go back and recover the values that the 60s destroyed, and one of these values was patriotism. The Vietnamese War was a terrible mistake, but here it is 30 years later, and the left is still sulking. We cannot have a situation where every expression of patriotic belief is automatically defined as conservative, or again, in some way benighted or parochial, or something that only rubes and hillbillies will do, and so on. We cannot have this, all right? I belong to a family whose uncles were sent to Europe to rescue the world from Hitler. We Italian Americans had to make a choice, which is why I think we're very patriotic. Italy was allied with Hitler. And everyone in my family, of my father's generation, had to make a choice between their native land and their new land. And they chose America. And many of them were injured, or fortunately, there were no deaths in my family, but there were injuries. My father was poised to drop into Japan, into the emperor's pavilion, and it was only the dropping of the bomb that stopped that. Probably his entire corps of paratroopers would have been slaughtered. They were assigned to take the emperor's dwelling and so on. And therefore, I have been very, very unhappy with the kind of sneering at patriotic belief that goes on routinely in the elite schools on the part of so-called progressive humanities faculty. And I think it has to stop. It is pernicious. Again, it is driving people to the right. It is natural for people to be patriotic. One thing that struck me when I arrived in Philadelphia 10 years ago was how proudly African American working class men and women wear the uniform. It struck me, right, how often I would see people wearing uniforms from all the different branches of the service, and the way people greeted them and so on. And I realized how different that was from the behavior of those lazy, good-for-nothing professors on the elite schools who never did anything in their lives. They're not the ones who are sending their children to war. I'm being beckoned to. Are we about to move into the question period? This is true. I tend to take audiences prisoner. We go on for hours. All right, we're going to have questions? All right, this will lighten the evening for you. All right. All right.
Okay, first question. You mentioned repeatedly, and to great effect, what you despise of current popular politics, culture, etc. What do you see? What do you love of what you see?
In politics, I think it seems to me indisputable that the MTV generation of young people is progressive. It is more tolerant of bisexual experimentation. It is extremely positive toward African American culture. I have great hopes for the future. I just want to improve the education that our young people are getting. So I think that young people in general are tolerant in their viewpoints, even when they identify themselves as conservative. I think that there's a kind of enlightened conservatism on the part of many young people that is not like the sort of Neanderthal conservatism that that is so stereotypical.
This is something that's appropriate to our city. What advice do you have for Hillary Clinton?
Fasten your seatbelts. This is a long story. I loved Hillary Clinton in the campaign. I was on the Donahue show with Susan Faludi the day that Hillary Clinton made that answer. In fact, Donahue surprised us by showing us the footage and asking us to comment on it, of her saying, well, listen, I could have stayed home and baked cookies. I loved that. I loved that tone in her, that kind of bitchy tone. And I thought she had a wonderful manner in the campaign. And anyone who may doubt this, if you just that film, The War Room, where you see little snippets of the way she was, it brings it all back for me very nostalgically. But it seems to me that from the moment of the inauguration, some change seemed to come over her. And one saw it even in her manner. It seemed like all of the charisma, it seemed to vanish from her. And she had a very kind of negative, sour look that gave me a kind of chill, even before he gave her the health care assignment, 1/8 of the national budget to deal with. I was very struck, and I think it's in the new book, how inauguration gala night, how buoyant Clinton was. He has the common touch. He was like enjoying himself and clapping, and tears were in his eyes and embracing everybody and so on. And he has the ability to enjoy himself. And she was sitting there the entire evening like this, totally buttoned up and tight. And again, a chill went through me, and I thought, oh no. It's almost like she'd lost her balance, lost her center. Now, my advice to the Clintons, I wasn't asked, but my advice would have been, considering the controversy over Hillary Clinton throughout the campaign, people calling her the Lady Macbeth of Little Rock and so on and so forth, considering how much animosity had built up, what an unknown quantity both she and he were, it seems to me it would have been wise to allow the country to get to know Hillary Clinton for a few months, to just be a normal first lady for a few months. Would it have killed them, to let her be a normal first lady? Allow the people to make visits to hospitals, be seen working in the flower bed, take Chelsea to the zoo. I mean all kinds of things. Then once she was put in charge of something controversial, she would have a power base. People would, she would be a familiar figure, and you wouldn't have what happened, which seemed to me utterly stupid and disastrous. Suddenly, several days after he took office, guess what? Okay, you thought she was just going to be a normal first lady. No, I'm giving her this. Okay. That was ridiculous. She had done nothing, very little in her career to deserve to be put in charge of this enormous program. Then the way she went about it, this huge, committee, the secrecy, the sense that it seemed like a despotic element in her was coming out. The Madame New or Evita Peron, part of her was coming out. And what I most regretted was the loss of that charismatic balance that she had during the campaign. That is, she began, she was frowning. Naturally, if you have so many, she reverted to her eager law student mode, right? Naturally, she wanted to do well, and so she was frowning. And you would see her, she would get off, the helicopter on the White House lawn. Those people have no sense at all of how to use TV, right? She would get off, and her collar would be up, her glasses, she'd look like a Russian spy. Her glasses like you'd see her in profile, hating the press, going right from the helicopter. Now, you all know, remember Reagan would go, like wave, what? Like that, One wants to feel that the people in the White House are balanced and centered and leading lives where they can go to bed at a good time. One wants to feel that the important decisions are being made by well-rested, well-rounded people. So, they dug themselves into a hole straight off. And also those first weeks, the disaster of the gays in the military thing, which let me just segue into that, because that was part of the ridiculous decisions being made there, the gays in the military thing, and the whole Clinton presidency came apart in the first week. The far right was demoralized. The far right had been defeated, all right? And the errors that were made in that first week allowed Rush Limbaugh, whom I do not demonize, whom I respect as an independent voice in this country, even though his political views are quite different than mine. Rush Limbaugh's power gained enormously, all right, as the Clintons offered themselves as perfect objects of satire. That's the point, okay? They became great jokes for comedians, all right, and so on. But the gays in the military thing, let me just talk about that, because. Now, my position as a libertarian is that no institution has the right to control what you do in your free time. That it seems to me that an institution can require that while you are serving in uniform or on an army base or whatever it might be, that you refrain from certain kinds of behaviors that are forbidden or whatever. But no one can stop you. If you want to leave there and go down and put on drag and go to a bar and have sex in alleyways, it's no one's business. This is my position. All right. However, I can understand why this is a very difficult problem, given the closeness of living quarters for soldiers. It's a very, very difficult decision. Once Clinton had indicated in the campaign that he intended, as best he could, to remove all barriers to gays serving in the military. Then it was his obligation, considering the burden he was carrying as someone who had never served in the armed forces and had this reputation as a draft dodger. It seemed to me incumbent upon him, first of all, to get the respect of the armed forces immediately. That was the first thing he had to do. That was the first job he should have done. The first weeks and months of that presidency, Bill Clinton should have been going out there and visiting bases. Before he ever raised the gay issue, he should have been out there visiting bases, getting to know the serving men, becoming popular with the armed forces, trying to understand the way they work. Right? Instead, he just threw this card on the table. It was so idiotic. So what he should have said was, all right, I'm going to appoint a committee to investigate this question. The nation knows that what my sympathies are here. I would like to know, however, all the problems that might result from such an executive order that I may make. I want that committee to report to me within 6 months. I will take it under advisement, and so on. All right, then all the problems should have been worked out in advance. Every logistic problem through gays, of gays now serving openly in the military should have been addressed and dealt with in a report. All right, with the committee reporting to him potential ways to solve those problems, all right? And the committee could have advised the president not to open the military to gays, all right? But it is up to the president to make the decision. Then I see him getting that report, then taking under advisement, and then writing a magnificent speech where he addresses the nation and makes a thoughtful speech all about civil liberties and civil rights and democratic principles and democratic ideals, and then says at the conclusion, and although I'm fully aware of the problems this will cause, and I have tried to investigate these fully, I am trying to be fair to everyone, it is my judgment that gays must be able to serve openly in the military. That is what he should have done, all right? But he's surrounded by idiots, okay? Clinton is a 60s progressive thinker, like everyone in my generation, but he surrounded himself with 80s yuppies. George Stephanopoulos, Mr. Yuppie Man, all right? I see him on the streets of Georgetown. I will pluck that man bald.
What do you think of Kurt Cobain and the music of Nirvana?
Well, on the one hand, I'm happy that the Generation X now has an authentic rock martyr, as we did. We had Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. I have to grieve in a way because it's the suicide that Kurt Cobain committed is, while it's a throwback really to early romanticism, the death of Chatterton and so on, it is so unlike the mainstream of avant-garde deaths, you know, like Jackson Pollock being drunk and having women in the car and wrecking, you know, and wrecking the automobile and all that. Jackson Pollock died actively, you know, and you know, and Jimi Hendrix had a hot night with a woman, and you know, and et cetera, and had come out from a party and so on. It was sort of an accidental death. It's one of the great burdens, I think, on Generation X, the enormous creativity of 60s rock musicians. I can understand the restiveness of young musicians, you know, this sort of staggering under the omnipresence on radio airplay of the boomer music and so on. And I think that's perhaps part of Kurt Cobain's melancholy, in a way. The difficulty of what my mentor Harold Bloom would call belatedness, of coming after the fact. You know, it's unfortunate. I don't, I'm, you know, again, as an Italian, I believe in directing my hostility and aggression outward. And I hope that my followers will punch and kick other people and not harm themselves.
How can you say there is no cleavage between art and pop art, but differentiate between good classic canonical text and modern relevant text?
Mm-hmm. Well, what I'm saying is that I want to preserve ideas of quality and value, but I want to merge these two traditions. Okay, so I can say, for example, I have made the statement that you know, the best novel written after World War II is Anti-Mame. And I mean that literally. I am not someone who reads the contemporary novel. I feel that that nonfiction has absorbed many of the fictive prerogatives and styles of the traditional novel that was at its high point in the 19th century. So I certainly am not someone who is simply traditional about the canon. I believe that the canon is always evolving, that one is constantly making decisions for each year, for each new generation of students, and so on. But I've for my entire life, have never made any automatic distinction of value between the classical tradition and the popular culture around me. And it was once, it was highly controversial. I can You know, I can recall, I looked at advertisements that I saw in magazines or on television as equivalent to the paintings that I saw in museums or the Egyptian hieroglyphics that I saw when I visited the Metropolitan Museum as a tiny child. And I always loved advertisements, always. In fact, one of the first big projects I did was in, I think it was like 6th grade or something. I did a whole, what today would be called a semiotic analysis, you know, and so on, of advertisements. For me, advertisements always had higher meaning. It could be because, like Andy Warhol, I was raised in a Catholic tradition with a lot of iconography around me, and so it was just very natural for me to move from the iconography of Mediterranean Catholicism to that of advertisement and so on. I think that even today, most people would not regard advertisements as an art form, but I do, so you know, again, I'm someone who I believe in great works of the past. I believe in, and I similarly believe in the canon of rock and roll. In fact, I've pointed out in a piece that I wrote for the Modern Review in England, that's in my new book, that when Lenny Kravitz does his Jimi Hendrix imitation, you are getting canon formation. That's canon formation, all right? That to invoke Hendrix's memory in that way. And unfortunately, for current musicians, no one has gone beyond Hendrix. People are trying vainly, to surpass him. Now and then, someone can produce the tone. Now and then, someone can turn the guitar upside down and get some other thing that he was able to do. But the totality of Jimi Hendrix's revolutionary sound, no one has been able to imitate. So we still are staggering. In contemporary rock, under this the burden of the canon in rock, and this is true of every culture. See, I despise the provincialism of debate about these issues in America, because every single great civilization of the world has its own canon. I mean, Japan has, if you go to an African tribe, you would find that there were certain artworks and styles that were esteemed and considered canonical. And then as you go down, you have people breaking the canon and remaking it, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's fun. Mm-hmm.
All right. You criticize ACT UP for interrupting the Mass in New York, but what do you propose gay men and lesbians do as they are dying and Cardinal O'Connor is advocating homophobia?
Well, here's the problem, okay, with the gay activist discourse on this question. The point that's being missed here, dying, that's the physical body. What the Catholic Church is about is the soul. Again, I speak as an atheist. These are two different realms. And if there's anything that Hinduism teaches you or Buddhism teaches you, it's the frailty and, in fact, the non-reality of the body. This is what's missing in the gay activist attack on Catholicism. It's completely missing the fact that you're getting, as always in all the great world traditions, all right, the elevation of the spirit above the body. The suffering body must not become the ruler of the spirit. This is the whole lesson of the crucifix that people meditate on, for heaven's sakes. Right? The soul is greater. The immaterial is greater. Every world religion deals with this. In the Far Eastern religions, the idea of Maya or Samsara, the veil of illusion, and so on. Right? It seems to me there's such a lack of philosophical perspective, a lack of any kind of deep understanding in the minds of our white middle class gay activists, and because they are largely coming out of, one of my opponents in New York is this woman with an enormous amount of money, an heiress, and so on, who's never had a bad day in her life, and so on. And I'm coming out of a tradition that is much more practical, much more hands-on, and so on. I think that I'm more in tune with working class values in many ways than a lot of these very sanctimonious and very, to me, puerile activists who have launched this attack on the Catholic Church, which will result, it seems to me, in a profound backlash that will take 30 years to undo. And it is gay men who will pay the price of this. Gay men who will pay, because they are the most vulnerable when they cruise at night and so on. And it's not gay women who will suffer from this. So I am very, very, very worried. For example, the stupidity of the way the rainbow curriculum was handled in New York City. All right, the way I'm an educator for 23 years. Was the input of the input of any gay educators of my standing? Were we ever asked to contribute to these plans, Rainbow Curriculum in New York or Policy 102 in Philadelphia? They have created such a backlash against gays. I have said that the Rainbow Curriculum, that whole controversy in New York, it managed to radicalize grandmothers. Grandmothers came out to protest the intrusion of gay issues into the elementary school curriculum. Seems to me utterly absurd, the way that's handled. I speak as someone who was taught in art schools. The issue, and someone whose work deals openly with homosexuality and so on. So these are highly charged issues. We cannot have them being forced down people's throats. We cannot have preachers of the right or preachers of the left teaching sex and in that way, telling people how they should believe and so on. To me, the Rainbow Curriculum, as that was handled in New York, was an outrageous act of cultural imperialism by white middle-class activists against the working class, for whom they claim to speak. And I've also said that, for 500 years, the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church could not get together. Only one thing has ever brought them together. Gay activism has brought them together, all right? The ecumenical mission of gay activism, all right? And so what is the end result is that the clumsiness and stupidity with which this was handled has managed to produce this octopus of the Christian coalition across the country now organizing at the school board level. Because I, too, oppose this kind of forcing of gay things down the throats of the young. That's not the way to do it. I would have recommended that the primary school curriculum be more art-centered. We introduce art into the curriculum. The contemplation of the nude, of sexual beauty in male and female form through world art. Once you start doing that, you can then introduce the question of the artist who's usually an eccentric or a dissenter. You see, this is how I would approach it. An education built around the idea of dissent, the dissenter versus the group. And gay activists or homosexual expression, that's only one form of dissent. I would like all forms of dissent to be presented. Because these proposals were not put together in a scholarly or historical fashion. They failed, and they created this backlash, all right, that I think, again, is going to worsen and worsen. And I'm also on record as saying I oppose condom distribution in schools. I fail to see why schools are being turned into social welfare centers. It is proper, it seems to me, for public health clinics to handle that. If gay activists believe so much in condom distribution, let them stand outside the schoolyard and hand out the condoms, all right? Let them sprinkle them in the streets, or have little like Easter egg rolls and so on. And so on, all right? But I just hate the way education in this country on the primary school level has been politicized. My mother was an immigrant from Italy, and she had the benefit of, as I did, of fantastically rigorous public school education. The schools were highly disciplined, they were focused on basics, and they allowed all these many ethnic groups to Americanize. And I owe my present skills as a thinker and a reader and a writer to that education I received that's now gone down the tubes. And I do not want to see more politicization, more use of the schools, again, as health centers or babysitters or whatever. And I want it to return to education, but I do want a reformed education, and I think I have been detailed in my proposals of how I would like things to be restructured. But I believe learning must be at the center. Learning. Now, even to espouse learning these days is considered reactionary, because, of course, what you're supposed to learn is theory, all right, or goodwill, or self-esteem, and so on. And when in point of fact, it is people with the least self-esteem that often turn out to be the great creators. All right, that is the drive. Have you ever, you know all about the studies of comedians, right? Well known that comedians are, they have the lowest self-esteem, in the world. They all come out of very bad family backgrounds, and and obviously negative about themselves, et cetera, et cetera. So in fact, it is an opposite correlation between self-esteem and achievement. It's usually the people who, Michelangelo. I mean, people took did a psychological study of Michelangelo. He had very low self-esteem. He also was the most brilliant, and a creator in the history of the arts. It's gigantic. He drove himself because it was only by his art that he made himself complete. But let's go.
Where exactly would you fit African American discourse in your Judeo-Christian Greco-Roman dichotomy?
Well, for me, I would say that in some sense it is pagan. That is, I'm very interested, I've been reading recently about African history. I think that we need much more direct study of African history and not a lot of preaching, and propaganda, using these sentimental models of white imperialism and colonialism and the poor, oppressed, the women, people of color. I hate these paternalistic sort of soap opera depictions of history. What I want is what we really need, all right, is the sense of traditions, of religious traditions. And Africa seems to me very, very interesting because you see there, in Africa, something similar to what we have in this current coming over from Europe. That is, there is a conflict in African, sub-Saharan African culture between the original tribal or pagan cults that are nature cult, that belong to, that are, go way back into remotest antiquity, and Islam that comes down into Africa along the caravan routes all the way to West Africa. In fact, people have, of course, noticed elements of Islamic music in blues brought here, by West African slaves and so on. There are certain elements that are in the melisma of blues, the way the voice is used and so on, is not unlike that of the call to prayer of the mullahs and so on in Islam. And so actually African culture has a similar dichotomy, and it's still going on, as I know from friends who are African American and so on. The blues was considered the devil's music. Certainly those of you who know about Robert Johnson and so on would realize that he felt himself in some way an instrument of Satan. He was condemned as that because there is a strongly conservative strain in African American culture, that spiritual strain that believes that the blues is too full of sexuality and so on. So right there you get this, there's the voodoo element in African American music, is the pagan element, where it's exactly the same kind of dichotomy, and I think it produces the incredible range of African American achievement in music. So you get the spirituals and the gospel tradition, and then you get the kind of bawdy, raunchy blues tradition leading into soul and funk and so on, and there's a clash still going on with some people wanting to reform the kind of language that's in rap and the kind of overt sexuality and the expressions of aggression, the four-letter words, etc. So I would work African American culture into this discourse in that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think of the controversial new book, The Bell Curve?
Well, I haven't had a chance to look at the book itself. I have seen the media reports, and I have talked to reporters about the book. But again, I would say that I feel the subject of anything involving genetics is crucial to investigate. We must investigate it. I personally feel at this time that the evidence is too flimsy to make any final statements about any racial differences. I wouldn't be surprised if it was discovered that certain groups have different talents and so on. But as far as I can see, this the kind of so-called intelligence that's being measured by these tests that led to this book is simply, it is a kind of European discourse. It's what in sexual personae I define as the Apollonian element. Okay, and for example, I used to think, as a teacher, who's observing for so many different kinds of schools over so many years, I used to think that is it possible that Jews are genetically smarter than other people, because it seemed to me absolutely inescapable. There was no way to avoid the conclusion that Jews are simply smarter. They always, whatever school I've taught in, they always have, in some sense, an edge over many others. But then as the decades went on, I began to wonder whether there were not cultural reasons for this. That is, I personally feel that stimulation of the child's brain early on, very, very early on, and indeed the response to this book seems to be bearing this out, stimulation of even the infant's brain in an analytical way will give the student in advance. I mean, because right now we're in a period where fathers are talking to the fetus while the fetus is still in the womb, so that the fetus can recognize the father's voice, and yes, I can feel it stirring, it is stirring, and so on. Or playing music to the fetus, before birth, et cetera, et cetera. If that is true, that the baby can be affected in the final weeks of pregnancy by stimulation coming from outside the mother's body, then I think that there is a reason to suspect there may be cultural reasons for the advance that it seems to me that my Jewish students have, and that is that Jewish culture is very word-centered. There's a use of language in the Jewish tradition, Talmudic or rabbinic use of language is highly disputatious. There's an aggressive style to Jewish discourse, which is why my mentors are always Jews, because Harold Bloom and the poet Milton Kessler and so on, because, I joke, Jews are the only people who can stand me. I'm just too extreme, for most people. And so I wouldn't be surprised if, because I personally feel myself that my parents, for example, we were an immigrant family. My parents were constantly talking to each other, constantly. They never stopped talking to each other, and they were always analyzing what was wrong with American culture, okay? Because we had the sense of being this kind of enclave, Italian-American enclave, in the middle of this kind of hostile WASP culture filled with blonde people, And so I have the sense of having been born thinking, because I believe listening, and hearing words, and so there's kind of a verbal track in my brain, just as there's a music track. And I think that people say, well, what do you recommend for people who are concerned about their children? We had no money. It's ridiculous to talk in terms of class here, all right? Because we had no money at all. But my parents believed in reading to me early on. I think that's the best thing any parent can do for the child. The moment that baby can sit up, 6 months old, you get a book from the library if you can afford to buy a book. You start reading to the child and literally developing that baby's analytic the part of the brain. Again, this is not the totality of the brain; it's part of the brain. But if the child is going to go into any of the professions, he or she will need that stimulation early on. And I think that's maybe what these tests are registering. That is that the African American culture on the working class level is an oral tradition, and that there is, for example, I have a friend, the writer Bruce Benderson, who speaks of he has friendships with young Puerto Ricans and so on in New York City, and he says that what so amazes him, and many of them have dropped out of school and they've never completed high school or anything like that, but he says that you tell them a phone number, right? They never forget the phone number, all right? He said it orally, all right? Give them a piece of paper, they'll lose it, all right? And see, and this is there's an enormous memory system built into the oral tradition. I mean, this is well known, that Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, these were works of performance art. You'd have a poet a bard singing from memory for 24 hours at a stretch. And we have slowly, as we move from an oral to a literate culture, there's a whole part of the brain that's now vestigial, all right? And the oral tradition has its own logic, right? And so I think that's the flaw, the major flaw for me in this study, is that it is very Eurocentric in its premises. That we must, if we're going to examine African American culture, you have got to devise whole other ways of you're making the map of the African American soul, you might say. Yeah, go on.
All right. What do you think of the latest royal family shenanigans?
Well, I'm a great fan of Diana. In fact, there's a piece I wrote for the New Republic on Diana in my new book, and in it I discuss how she fulfills many of the great archetypes of the princess in the tower and the abandoned maiden like Perseus and Andromeda and so on, that feminism had thought it had swept away. Her worldwide popularity is staggering, because here is a woman who never went to university, has never said more than 5 consecutive words in public, and yet is beloved by peoples of the world. I mean, in nation after nation and so on. In some way, she has a kind of emotional bond with them. It's coming out of her suffering womanhood. So I think the question of Diana, it forces us, I think, to reassess the way in feminism of the last 20 years, the career woman with the attaché case has become the ultimate, perfect, valuable person. And we don't realize how this kind of, this is a form of Western parochialism, our obsession with the person with the attaché case, right? And that most of the world can still identify so powerfully with Diana. Well, to me, it's like, of course, I am a soap opera fan, so this is I'm very entertained. The Young and the Restless is my favorite soap. I have been watching it for 20 years. So I would say that the House of Windsor is my second favorite soap.
Well, I think we're a little bit worried about you having time to sign your
Oh, no.
But so we have time for one more.
Oh, let's have one more.
My niece is My niece is an exotic dancer. Please talk about your thoughts on her role in society.
Yes. Well, just in this last month's issue of Penthouse, there was an article where that was sort of really was a recorded interview that the reporter Melanie Wells had with me as we went around strip clubs in New York. We went to 3 different levels of strip clubs, from the sleaziest to the most polished, and I carried on, and tried to demonstrate that the current feminist line about stripping is completely wrong. The idea that the woman exposing her body is merely a piece of meat, that she is a sex object, inert and passive beneath the male gaze, one of those horrible cliches that are everywhere in women's studies programs and so on. And I showed how such feminist ideas are totally out of sync with the reality. When you go to the reality, the reality contradicts this, the projection, all right? Because in the strip clubs, you will see that the men are admiring what they see, number one. They're not looking down on it, all right? The women are in control of the encounter. The men need to go in packs because they're so terrorized, all right? The strip clubs are, for me, pagan shrines where men go to worship female power. And the dancers will tell you as much. They have an enormous sense of power on stage. Now, of course, there are very low-level ones where there are women who are on heroin who are doing this because they have to. But I hate this stereotyping of an entire profession by the lowest common denominator. That feminists do that for the strippers, and they do it for prostitutes too. Because I say in my new book that the most successful prostitutes in history have been invisible. The ones that you see are the ones that, Dr. Joyce Brothers drags them on TV, and they complain they were abused as children, and they're miserable, and so on and so forth. Again, these are the losers. These are the people who had no vocation for it to begin with. There is nothing degrading in the exhibition of any part of the human body. This is why I so love gay male culture, because they understand this. The anti-porn wing of feminism always ignores the enormous worldwide industry of gay male pornography, because it completely explodes these assumptions that pornography degrades women, and pornography is all about the exploitation of women. Well, how does that apply to man-on-man pornography? Right? No one in the gay male world believes that a nude boy is degrading himself, right? Or that the person looking at him is like looking down at him. Everyone knows you're looking up at this magnificent creature, right? It's like in Greek antiquity, where you had the beautiful boys, the beautiful athletes, the winners of the games, erected onto pedestals, right? And that is what I see is going on in the strip clubs. There are Hindu temples with copulating threesomes and foursomes. Hinduism sees sex as part of the continuum of nature. It is our problem in Judeo-Christianity to continually view sex as somehow dirty and belonging to that fallen realm. So again, I feel that the strip clubs and the ubiquity of prostitution and pornography, despite every effort to ban them, that this is again is part of the stubborn pagan element in Western culture. It's part of the way the culture makes itself whole. Because many of these men who go to these clubs are at home, they have wives and children and happy home life and so on, but there's clearly something in our culture which is insufficient and which is driving men to go there and to, I view these women on stage in the strip clubs dancing, I view them as if they are bonfires, as if they are the creative principle, and the men are coming to warm themselves at this fire. So I feel that the feminism of the 21st century will be pro-art, pro-sex, pro-porn, pro-men. So.
Thank you for your time.
University of Pennsylvania humanities professor Camille Paglia spoke Wednesday evening at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She's the author of several books, including Sex, Art, and the American Culture. You can again see this program tomorrow morning around 7:45 Eastern Time, 4:45 Pacific on C-SPAN 2. And on C-SPAN's Sunday Journal, our guests focus on the morning news headlines and try to put major issues into perspective. Sunday Journal also includes a look at the week in politics, an update on major legislation, and a glimpse into the social side of Washington. C-SPAN's Sunday Journal begins Sunday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 Pacific Time on our companion network, C-SPAN. Next, you'll hear from Labor Secretary Robert Reich. Wednesday morning, Secretary Reich answered viewer and C-SPAN intern questions about the state of employment, the workplace, and wage earnings. The discussion runs about 45 minutes.
Secretary of Labor Robert Reich, in this morning's Wall Street Journal, page 2, there's a headline, "Most Americans see their income slip even though the economy is booming." What's that mean?
It means exactly what it says, Brian. For 15 years, median earnings have been going down. Half of Americans have seen their incomes go down, and many Americans feel very insecure with corporate downsizings, defense downsizings, all of the deregulation and international trade. The economy is a much more tumultuous place. Gone forever are the days where you could leave high school or even drop out of high school and look forward to a pretty decent factory job paying the equivalent of $16 to $24 a year, an hour. And gone forever the days when you could count on job security. If you did your job well and your employer maintained profits, the old unwritten contract was you could maintain your employment. Well, those days are no longer here either. So even though we've created over the past 20 months 4 most respects. And also, I want to stress to you that working also as an academic is a job, believe it or not. And it can be a very hard and taxing job.
We'll go to our interns right after this call. Let's go to Mount Airy, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to point out that I think that unemployment is really a scam because you have to pay taxes on it. I mean, at 92, I was unemployed, and I received the compensation, and I really needed it. But now I have to pay $100 back to IRS and $50 to the state every month. Now, I'm employed, but, you know, I could really use that money. I could save it or something. I mean, it's really unfair to pay people that and expect them to pay taxes. I mean, could you please do something about repealing that?
We're looking at the entire unemployment system. Not only have I had a lot of complaints from people like you who say we shouldn't pay taxes on our unemployment checks, but also unemployment insurance only covers a very small proportion, in many cases, of former salaries. Only about a third to a half of workers who lose their job are covered by unemployment insurance in many states. So we have a system that in many respects is breaking down. It's not doing the job that it was originally intended to do. We have a group working at that. We have a commission set up to make recommendations back to Congress on that. I think there are many, many issues with unemployment insurance that need to be changed.
Stoff Smolson is a graduate of Georgetown, has a question, native of Washington, D.C.
Good morning, Mr. Secretary.
You've been inside the Beltway for your entire life.
I have been. It's been a pleasure. As a former professor, I'm sure you agree that teaching is one of the most important professions, for it nurtures the future. Yet, a newly published report by the American Federation of Teachers points out that teachers' salaries remain low, and the state